The wind pressed against the car windows, as if the sea itself were impatient for his arrival. Daniel Mercer eased his sleek black sedan onto the gravel road that led down toward the coast. The tires crunched over the uneven stones, a sharp contrast to the silent hum of city highways he was used to. Out there, in his world of glass towers and boardrooms, everything was polished, calculated, efficient. Here, the air smelled of salt and rust. The world seemed older, worn and utterly indifferent to his wealth. He glanced at the leather folder on the passenger seat. Inside, crisp white papers waited for his signature, the purchase agreement for the land surrounding the old lighthouse. Soon, if all went according to plan, that weather-beaten tower would no longer stand guard over this forgotten stretch of shoreline. It would be replaced by a luxury resort. Private villas, infinity pools, a helipad. Investors loved the concept. Guests would pay for exclusivity, for sunsets no one else could claim. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks out of habit. The gesture felt strangely out of place here, as though the sea wind might rust the polished silver. The lighthouse rose in the distance, a pale silhouette against the gray sky. From afar it looked tired, leaning ever so slightly as though bracing against time itself. Its paint had peeled away in strips, and the windows reflected only broken fragments of light. He thought of it as a relic, a piece of land waiting to be repurposed. Something profitable. Yet as he drew closer, he saw he wasn't set alone. A figure stood at the base of the lighthouse, small against the towering stone. She was wrapped in a thick wool shawl the color of driftwood. Her hair, silver, almost white, fluttered in the sea breeze, catching bits of sunlight like foam on waves. She didn't move as his car came to a halt a few yards away. She simply stood there, waiting, hands clasped in front of her. Daniel cut the engine. The silence that followed was immediate, filled only by gulls and the endless roll of the tide. He stepped out, shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The wind caught his coat, tugging it open, and he steadied the leather folder under his arm. The woman's eyes met his, pale blue, steady, not unkind but not yielding either. "Hey son," she said. Her voice was soft, carrying easily over the sound of the surf. "I said been waiting." Daniel froze. The word son unsettled him more than her presence itself. He searched her face, but it carried no recognition, not the kind that suggested she had mistaken him for someone else. She looked at him as though she had expected him. "I think you've mistaken me for somebody else," he said, keeping his tone measured. He learned to stay calm in negotiations, even when others tried to pull him off balance. "I am here on business." The woman tilted her head slightly, as if she heard every word but chose not to answer them directly. "Every year," she said. "Instead on this day, I stand here, because I knew you come back." Daniel tightened his grip on the folder. He didn't like riddles, didn't like being addressed in a way that stripped him of his position. Out here, there were no board members to defer to him, no assistants to smooth awkward moments, only the woman and her strange words. "I am here to finalize the purchase of this property," he said, more firmly this time. "The lighthouse, the land surrounding it, all of it will soon belong to Mercer Holdings. Perhaps you've heard." "I heard," she replied, calm as stone. "But the lighthouse isn't yours to take." Her words struck him with an unexpected weight. He glanced up at the tower, then back at her. She hadn't moved closer, yet there was a strange authority in her stillness, as if the ground itself favored her side. Daniel cleared his throat. "Everything has a price. You of all people should know that." A faint smile touched her lips, though it wasn't amusement, it was something softer, sadder. "Not everything, son." Again that word. He wanted to correct her, to insist on distance. But something in the way she spoke, neither demanding nor apologetic, made it harder to dismiss. The gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the sky. The tide swelled, crashing with more force against the rocks below. Daniel felt the salt air cling to his skin, rougher than the climate-controlled air he lived in. For the first time in years, he felt strangely exposed. He looked at the lighthouse, then at the woman again. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Her gaze didn't waver. "I someone who remembers you. Someone who's been here waiting while you were away chasing the world." Daniel's chest tightened, though he couldn't say why. He told himself it was irritation, the kind of unease that came from delays, and unexpected complications. Yet beneath that, something old stirred, a flicker, almost like recognition, though it slipped away when he tried to grasp it. He straightened his shoulders. I don't know what you think you know about me, but my business here is simple. This lighthouse isn't a home anymore. It's a liability. Soon it will be something better. You see. The woman didn't argue, she only nodded, her eyes steady, as if she had already heard this before from him, or from another time. Perhaps, she said softly. But tell me, Daniel, do you even remember what day it is? Her question hung in the salt air, heavier than the contract under his arm. The question lingered between them, carried by the restless wind. Daniel looked down at the folder in his hands, then back at the old woman. It's Thursday, he said flatly, though he already suspected that wasn't the answer she wanted. Her eyes softened, though they didn't leave his. It's your birthday, son. The words caught him off guard. He hadn't celebrated his birthday in years, not really. His assistant sent a cake to his office every year, the kind with his company logo carefully printed in frosting. He usually asked her to donate it to the staff lounge. To him, birthdays were another day to keep moving, another day to chase numbers, sign deals, outpace competitors. A birthday had no value beyond the reminder of how quickly time moved. Still, hearing it here in this raw place of wind and stone, the word birthday felt heavier. Daniel Sepp's jaw tightened. That Sepp's not relevant. The woman didn't argue. Instead, she turned and looked up at the lighthouse. The tower stood like a weary sentinel, its paint stripped, its once bright glass dulled by storms. Her hand brushed the stone wall as if she were touching the skin of an old friend. I've kept watch here, she said, her voice quieter now, almost lost beneath the surf. Every year, on this day, waiting. For what? The question escaped him before he could stop it. Her hand lingered on the stone. For you. Daniel frowned. You been mistaken. We and never met. I don't know you. She finally turned to face him again, the sea light glinting off her silver hair. Maybe not as you are now, but once you knew me. Something stirred at the edge of his memory. He almost brushed it away, but the insistence in her tone pinned him in place. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't come here for stories. I came here to make an offer. If you here because you live nearby, then you will benefit. Jobs, tourism, new life for this coast. That what I what I what I what I what I what he hated it, make an offer. If you what I what I what I what I what I what I her gaze softened again, though it held no trace of surrender. New life perhaps, but at the cost of old lives, old memories. Do you ever ask yourself what you start taking away when you replace everything with profit? Daniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself. I build, that is what I do. I turn forgotten places into something valuable. People thank me for it. She stepped closer, enough that he could see the fine lines etched around her mouth, the years mapped across her skin, but her eyes remained startlingly clear, like seawater after rain. Do you thank yourself for it? She asked softly. The question pierced deeper than he expected. He had an answer ready, of course, success, recognition, numbers that proved his worth, but something in her voice made those answers feel thin, like paper in a storm. The gulls cried overhead, swooping closer to the cliffs. The air smelled of brine, and the waves rolled with steady persistence, as though the sea itself was listening. He forced a faint smile, though it felt hollow. You speak like a philosopher, but this isn't SEPA philosophy. It's SEP's business, and business doesn't SEPA pause for nostalgia. The woman studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if she had expected exactly that. You SEP grown into a man who thinks that way, but you weren't SEP'd always. Daniel blinked, unsettled again. The wind tugged at his coat, and for a brief moment, he felt like a boy standing on this shore again, barefoot, sand sticking to his skin, listening to the low hum of the waves. The memory was so sudden, so vivid, that he almost swayed. He shook his head quickly, pushing the thought back. Whatever connection you think exists between us, it doesn't change why I'm here. He lifted the folder slightly, as though it proved his point. The woman's SEP's expression did not widen, though he half expected it to. Instead, she looked at the folder with quiet patience. Papers don't steps change the truth. Could show tools see it, if you stay long enough to look. Her words frustrated him because they carried no obvious argument, nothing he could dismantle. They were not the sharp negotiations he excelled at, instead they were like the sea, constant, patient, wearing away stone over time. Daniel glanced back at his car, its sleek frame gleaming unnaturally against the rugged coast. A part of him wanted to turn around, drive back to the city, to people who spoke his language, percentages, contracts, deadlines. But another part of him, quieter and more dangerous, wanted to know what else she might say. "You've been here all this time?" he asked finally. Her eyes drifted back toward the lighthouse. "Yes, every year. Some days it was lonely, some days the sea was cruel, but I stayed because I knew one day you stepped return." Daniel frowned. "Why me?" She looked at him again, and for the first time there was a flicker of something almost maternal in her gaze. "Because this was once your home." The words struck him with such force that he nearly lost his grip on the folder. He had not thought of this place as home in decades, perhaps not since childhood. He had buried those years under layers of ambition, telling himself they no longer mattered. But standing there, with the sea filling his ears, and the old woman's eyes fixed on him, the buried truth pressed against him like a tide rising too quickly to escape. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "That isn't possible." Her expression was calm, steady. "It steps more possible than you remember." The lighthouse loomed above them, its silent walls holding secrets he had chosen to forget. The sea wind carried the scent of salt and memory, and Daniel found himself unable to move, pinned between what he came for and what she insisted was waiting for him. The sea was louder now, though Daniel couldn't tell if the tide was rising, or if it was simply that his thoughts had grown too quiet to drown it out. He stared at the lighthouse, then at the woman again. She stood as though rooted to the stone, her hand brushing its surface in a gesture that looked almost like devotion. "This was never your home," he said carefully, his voice edged with the sharpness of defense. "I grew up in the city, my parents, my parents." He stopped himself, unsure why his tongue stumbled on the word. "They raised me there." The woman's sips gaze softened, though it did not waver. "Your parents brought you here once. You were so small you could barely see over the rocks. They wanted you to know the sea." Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to summon a rebuttal. He could picture nothing of what she described. His earliest memories belonged to tidy apartments, strict routines, his father's voice always sharp with ambition. No seaside, no crumbling lighthouse. Certainly, no woman waiting for him on birthdays. "You mistaken me for someone else," he said finally, gripping the folder more tightly. "I didn't come here for this. I came to finalize a purchase, that's all." The woman turned her face toward the sea, her shawl fluttering against the breeze. "That's what troubles me, son. You speak of buying, of finalizing, as though that's what life is. But this place isn't yours to buy. It never was. You belong to it, not the other way around." The words irritated him. They clashed against everything he built his empire on, the belief that money and contracts gave structure, that ownership was power. "I built myself," he said sharply. "I belong to no one, and nothing. The world doesn't hand you what you need, you take it." The old woman didn't argue. Instead, she studied him quietly, her expression unreadable. "Then why," she asked softly, "do you look so tired?" The question hit like a stone dropped into still water. He stiffened, the old reflexes of pride pushing him to smirk, to dismiss, to pivot back into control. Yet for a moment, he couldn't. Because she was right. The salt wind pressed against his face, the sea roared at his back, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the ache of exhaustion in his chest, not from travel or long hours, but from something older, something hollow. He turned his eyes back to the lighthouse, its windows broken, its paint weathered. "This place isn't worth anything, as it is," he said finally, forcing his voice steady. "It's crumbling, dangerous, useless. I offering to give it new purpose." The woman stepped closer now, slow but steady. "Purpose doesn't always mean profit," she said. "Sometimes purpose is memory, sometimes it steps waiting." Daniel exhaled, his breath fogging in the cool air. "Waiting for what? For me?" That's absurd. She looked at him as though he were still a boy, fragile and unguarded. Not absurd, she said. Faithful. He almost laughed, though the sound caught in his throat. Faith one set rebuild these walls. Faith one set attract investors. Maybe not, she said softly. But faith is what brought you here, even if you don't see it yet. Daniel shook his head. No. Business brought me here. Her pale blue eyes searched his face. Then why did you come yourself, and not send a lawyer? The question landed with quiet precision. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He had asked himself the same thing on the drive over. Normally, these transactions required little more than a signature. He could have handled it from the 47th floor of his office. Yet something he hadn't named, compelled him to make the trip. He looked at her, unsettled. That doesn't prove anything. She smiled faintly. Maybe not, but perhaps it proves you still listening. The gulls cried again, circling low as the tide pressed against the rocks. Daniel felt the folder heavy in his hand, its polished edges cutting into his palm. You wasting your time, he said finally. Whatever story you holding on to, it won't stop this deal. The old woman looked at the folder, then back at him. Her voice was calm, even kind. I don't need to stop the deal. The truth will. You just don't remember it yet. He turned toward the sea, unwilling to meet her gaze. The horizon stretched endlessly, gray water folding into gray sky, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt small. The lighthouse loomed at his side, silent and steady, holding secrets he wasn't ready to face. Yet, deep in his chest, beneath the armor of success and ambition, something stirred, something like recognition, fragile but insistent. He gripped the folder tighter, as though paper could anchor him against the tide of memory pressing at the edges of his mind. Daniel sat on a low stone wall near the base of the lighthouse, the folder of contracts resting stiffly on his lap. The sea spray clung to his coat, and his polished shoes looked absurd in the wet sand. He told himself he wasn't rattled, that he had stood firmer against investors far more ruthless than an old woman with a strange claim. Yet her words kept circling in his mind, like the gulls overhead. This place isn't yours to buy, you belong to it. He shook his head, as if to scatter them. You've mistaken me for someone who cares about fairy tales, he said finally. His voice came out sharper than he intended. The woman stood only a few paces away, her hands folded in front of her shawl. She did not flinch at his tone. You're not mistaken, son. You just don't remember. I don't have time to remember, he snapped, rising to his feet. I came here with a clear purpose. I don't run a charity, and I don't make decisions based on sentiment. This lighthouse is a liability, and my investors expect results. Do you understand that word, results? Her expression did not harden, if anything it softened, which only irritated him more. Yes, she said gently. But do you understand the word loss? He frowned, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Loss is what happens when you fail to calculate properly, and I don't fail. Her gaze searched him for a long moment, then she stepped closer, her voice low but steady. Loss is what happens when you bury the parts of yourself that mattered most, when you trade them for numbers on paper. Daniel's fingers twitched against the folder. He wanted to dismiss her, but something in her words stung. He turned his back, staring out at the restless horizon. The sea was endless, indifferent, and it mocked his certainty. I didn't come here to debate philosophy, he said after a pause. I came here to close a deal, and that's exactly what I do. His voice was steady, but his thoughts were not. He tried to summon the armor he always wore in boardrooms, the calm control, the precise language, the dominance of someone who knew every figure and margin by heart. But here, the numbers meant nothing. His words fell into the roar of the waves and dissolved before they reached her. The woman moved closer still, until she was beside him, looking at the lighthouse as he did. Her hand brushed the stone wall, fingertips resting against the cracks. Do you hear it? She asked. Hear what? His tone was clipped. The sea, she said. It never stops speaking. You've trained yourself not to listen, but you can silence it, and you can silence memory. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. I silence distractions. That's why I built what I built. And yet, she murmured, you came here yourself. He turned to her, a flicker of frustration breaking through. Because this land is worth millions. Because I don't trust anyone else to secure it. Oh, that's why. Her eyes met his, unwavering. Or because some part of you remembered, some part of you needed to come back. Daniel looked away quickly. The truth in her voice unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He opened the folder, flipping through the clean pages, reminding himself of the reality he controlled: signatures, terms, guarantees. Here, he was in command. This is what matters, he said firmly, tapping the contract. This is the language of the world. Not stories, not memories, not waiting at lighthouses. The woman smiled faintly, as though she had heard the same defiance many times before. You stare unshaken now. But storms have a way of finding cracks. The words landed in him like salt water in a wound. He closed the folder sharply, the sound loud in the open air. I don't break. She studied him with quiet patience. No, she said softly, you bend yourself into something hard enough to survive. But there is a difference between surviving and living. Daniel clenched his jaw. He wanted to walk away, to return to the warmth of his car and the certainty of steel and glass. Yet his feet stayed rooted. He felt the pull of the lighthouse at his side, the pull of her voice, the pull of something old inside him that refused to be silenced. The waves crashed harder now, spraying mist over the rocks. The gulls screamed overhead, restless and insistent. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, drawing a long breath. When he opened them, the lighthouse loomed, ancient and unyielding, as though it too were waiting for him to admit something he had long denied. He gripped the folder, pressing it against his chest like a shield. This deal will happen, he said, his voice quieter but no less firm, no matter what you say. The woman nodded slowly, almost kindly, as though she pitied him. Perhaps, she said. But remember, son, you can buy your way out of yourself. The words clung to him even as he turned his back on her, staring at the horizon. For all his certainty, Daniel felt the first crack appear, small but undeniable, beneath the armor he had spent his life perfecting. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of seaweed and something faintly metallic, like rust on old chains. Daniel turned his collar against the chill, but the scent lingered, unsettling in its familiarity. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the folder clutched under his arm. Numbers, agreements, legal weight, those were the things he understood. But the air here was thick with things that didn't fit into contracts. Memory, silence, patience. The old woman hadn't moved. She stood with her hand resting against the stone of the lighthouse, her shawl pulled tighter against the wind. Her presence seemed fused to the tower, as though she belonged to it as much as the sea. You're certain we've never met? She asked, her voice gentle but carrying easily in the salt air. Daniel let out a slow breath. I told you, I grew up in the city. Her eyes searched him, not with suspicion but with a kind of quiet persistence. Then tell me, Daniel, why do your eyes recognize this place before your mind does? The question irritated him because it rang with a truth he didn't want. He had felt it since stepping out of the car, a disquiet that wasn't just from her presence. The lighthouse, the rocks, the endless gray waves, something about them had pressed against him with an almost physical weight. He tightened his grip on the folder. You sipped her imagining things. She didn't argue. Instead, she looked out toward the horizon. Children don't forget the sea so easily. Its sound, its smell, they stay in the bones. The words hit harder than he expected. For a moment he closed his eyes, if only to shut her out. But in the dark, something flickered. He was small, barely tall enough to hold the hand that guided him along the rocky shore. The air was colder then, or maybe it only felt that way because he was little. A woman's voice hummed behind him, a tune that rose and fell with the rhythm of the waves. He remembered the scrape of barnacles under his fingertips, the taste of salt on his lips when he laughed too hard. And the lighthouse, always the lighthouse, its beam sweeping slowly over the dark sea. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He drew a breath so sharp it burned. The old woman was watching him quietly. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but her gaze told him she had seen the memory break through. That's nothing, he said quickly, shaking his head, as though to clear it. Just a trick of the mind. The sea does that to people. Her expression softened, the corners of her mouth bending into something like sorrow. It sets not a trick, it sets a beginning. Daniel turned away, facing the horizon. The memory still clung to him, unwelcome, and too vivid. He hadn't thought of himself as a child in years, hadn't allowed those kinds of images to intrude on the clean order of his life. Childhood was chaos, vulnerability, things he had long since buried beneath steel and glass. But the memory had been real, too real. He could almost feel the sting of salt in his eyes, the warmth of a hand steadying him against the rocks. He pressed his thumb hard against the folder Sep's spine, grounding himself. Even if it happened, he said, his voice low, it doesn't Sep matter now. I still built a life. This place has nothing to do with me anymore. The woman Sep's eyes softened, and for a moment he thought she might reach out to touch his arm. But she didn't Sept, she only said, you can tell yourself that, but memory has its own patience. It waits until you step or quiet enough to hear it. Daniel exhaled, a sound closer to frustration than release. He hated how calm she was, how certain. It wasn't the kind of certainty he knew. Numbers, forecasts, projections. Trish was older, rooted in something he couldn't buy or control. The gulls shrieked overhead, swooping low. Daniel looked up, watching them wheel against the gray sky. For the briefest moment, he thought of a child's laughter, his own, carried by the wind, and it made his chest ache. He turned back to her, his voice steady again, though softer. You expect me to believe I once belonged here? That this lighthouse is what? My home? She nodded once, simply, yes, and it's Seps why I Seps waited.
Hey!
Because even if you buried it, I knew one day it would find you. Her words hung between them, not heavy but steady, like the pulse of the waves. Daniel looked down at the folder in his hands. The pages inside suddenly felt thin, insubstantial. He could sign them, close the deal, walk away. That was the life he had built for himself, but the memory had cracked something open, and he wasn't sure the papers could hold it shut again. The lighthouse loomed above, silent and watching, as though it had witnessed all of this before. For the first time in years, Daniel felt unsteady, not because of risk or failure, but because a piece of himself he thought long gone had risen from the dark. The light shifted as the clouds parted, casting a pale silvery glow across the water. For a moment the horizon looked endless, the sea spilling into the sky. Daniel stood still, the folder heavy in his hand, though he barely noticed it anymore. The memory that had cracked through earlier clung to him with stubborn persistence. He could taste the salt, hear the laughter of a boy who felt impossibly far from the man he had become. The woman had not moved. She leaned lightly against the stone of the lighthouse, her shawl pulled close. Her face was calm, but her eyes, those steady pale eyes, watched him with a quiet, knowing that made him restless. You stare holding back, she said softly. I saw it in you just now, something came to you did instead it. Daniel clenched his jaw. He wanted to deny it, to retreat into the safety of control, but the truth pressed against him too sharply. He turned his gaze away, staring at the restless line of waves. A fragment, that's Sep's all. It doesn't Sep mean anything. Her voice came low, steady. Fragments are where remembering begins. He shook his head. Even if I did, even if there's Sep's something, it's Sep's too faint to matter. I can Sep's build a life out of scattered images of salt air and stones. She straightened then, taking a small step closer. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though she were cautious not to startle him. Do you remember a song? She asked. Daniel frowned. A song. Her lips curved faintly, almost a smile. I used to hum it when the sea grew loud at night. You were afraid of storms. Do you remember? For a moment, he almost laughed. The idea was absurd. Him afraid of storms. He was a man who stared down boardrooms, who weathered economic crashes without blinking. But before he could dismiss it, something stirred. A sound, faint and wavering, came from the edge of memory. A woman's voice, humming a low tune that rose and fell like the waves themselves. He inhaled sharply. The old woman's Sep's eyes softened. You do remember? Daniel turned quickly, his coat flaring in the wind. No, I don't. This is. He stopped, unable to find the word. She took another step closer. I cared for you, Daniel. When your parents were gone, I was here. At this lighthouse, I held you when you cried for them. I walked you down to the rocks when the tide was gentle. You learned the sea by my hand. The words struck him like a blow. He felt the breath leave his chest, and the ground seemed less certain beneath him. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice was thinner now. "I was raised in the city. My father, he built everything I am." Her face shifted at that, a shadow of sorrow moving across it. "Your father built walls. He wanted you to forget this place, and you did for a time, but not everything can be buried." Daniel Sepp's hand tightened around the folder, until the edges bent. "You expect me to believe I lived here, that you, looked after me, like a mother?" Her expression didn't waver, though her voice softened. "Not your mother, but I gave you what I could, in her absence. Food, warmth, stories. I hummed you to sleep when the storms frightened you." The fragment of memory stirred again, clearer now. A dark night, lightning flashing across the sea, the boy curled beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. A soft voice humming close to his ear, steadying him against the thunder. He swallowed, his throat tight. The woman Sepp's gaze held his. "That's why I waited, Daniel. Every year on this day, because I knew you would come back, even if you didn't know why." The silence between them stretched, only the waves spoke, crashing with endless patience against the rocks. Daniel looked down at his polished shoes, the city man's armor against the raw ground. He felt absurdly out of place, standing here in silk and leather while his past clung to him like wet sand. Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked, finally, his voice low. She drew her shawl tighter, her eyes clouded. "Perhaps they thought it was kinder, or perhaps they thought forgetting would make you stronger. But I knew forgetting would cost you something too. That's why I stayed. That's why I waited." Her words wrapped around him like the sound of that old lullaby, steady, unyielding. Daniel turned his face toward the lighthouse again. Its paint was stripped, its windows broken, yet it stood firm against the sea. For the first time he wondered if he had been the one crumbling all along. He closed the folder slowly, pressing it under his arm. The contract suddenly felt less like a promise, and more like a betrayal. The woman Sepp's voice came again, soft but steady. "You don't have to decide today, just, remember, let the sea speak, let yourself hear it." Daniel looked at her, at the fine lines etched by years of waiting, and felt something heavy move inside him, guilt, gratitude, longing. He couldn't yet name it, but it rooted him to the shore. For the first time in years, Daniel Mercer didn't feel like a businessman standing on a deal. He felt like a boy, returning to a place he had once called home, though he had forgotten it until now. The sea had a way of filling silence, pouring into the spaces between words, until it seemed to speak in their place. Daniel stood with his back to the waves, but the sound pressed against him like a constant reminder that he wasn't as composed as he wanted to appear. The folder under his arm was damp at the edges now, the spray from the tide having marked its clean white papers with faint stains. It bothered him more than he expected. He liked things precise, orderly, untouched by the mess of the world. Yet here, even paper refused to remain pristine. The old woman had not moved closer. She gave him space as though she knew he needed it. She only leaned against the lighthouse wall, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes steady. There was patience in her stillness, the kind that unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. "You've been carrying yourself like stone," she said at last. "But even stone cracks when the sea leans on it long enough." Daniel Sepp's lips pressed into a line. "You don't know me. I knew you before you knew yourself," she replied gently. Her words drew a sharp breath from him. He tried to push them aside, but they clung. "You built walls," she continued. "Tall ones. I can see that. But walls don't only keep pain out, they keep life out too." Daniel turned sharply, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Those walls are why I'm standing here as I am. They're why I'm not broken. Do you have any idea what it takes to build what I've built? Discipline, focus, strength. I don't have the luxury of sitting by the sea waiting for something that never comes." Her face softened, though her voice stayed calm. "And yet, here you are, on the very shore you say you've forgotten. Holding papers you don't seem so sure about." Daniel looked down at the folder again. The contract was intact, yet it felt fragile in his grip, as though one strong gust might rip it from him. He turned his gaze to the lighthouse, its tower scarred but unyielding. "Places like this don't survive on memory," he said. They fall apart unless someone rebuilds them. That's what I do. I rebuild. Or replace, she said quietly. Her words stung, because they rang true. He replaced old structures with new ones, stories with statistics, faces with signatures, always forward, never back. But the crack inside him widened as he stood there. He could feel it, an unease, a trembling he couldn't disguise. It wasn't weakness exactly, but it was something close to longing. He closed his eyes for a moment, and there it was again, the fragment of memory. Small feet on wet sand, a hand gripping his to steady him against the pull of the tide. A voice, humming against the roar of a storm. He could feel the warmth of a shawl wrapped around his shoulders, the same kind of wool she wore now. He opened his eyes quickly, his breath catching. The old woman's Sep's gaze softened further, as if she knew exactly what had passed through him. You see, she said gently. You remember more than you think. Daniel turned away, staring out at the horizon. He hated the way his chest tightened, the way the sea seemed to press memory into him, no matter how hard he resisted. I don't have time for this, he said, though the conviction in his voice faltered. I came here for business, that's all. And yet, she murmured, business doesn't seem to be what's holding you here. Her words slipped through the cracks in his armor like water seeping into stone. He clenched his jaw, trying to harden himself again, but the effort left him feeling more tired than strong. He realized then how long he had been tired. Years perhaps, tired of striving, of proving, of holding everything together as though collapse would mean failure. The armor had carried him far, but it had also weighed him down. Daniel lowered the folder slowly, pressing it against the stone wall beside him. For the first time his grip loosened. The woman watched, her expression calm, almost tender. You don't have to decide everything now, she said softly. All I ask is that you let yourself feel what you kept buried. Her words frightened him more than any business risk ever had. He had built his life on control, and now control was slipping. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a relief so faint he barely recognized it. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the heavy sky. Daniel lifted his eyes, watching them glide freely on the wind. For the briefest moment, he envied them. He drew a breath, slow and shaky, and let it out again. The crack in his armor had widened, and though he tried to close it, he knew some part of him no longer wanted to. The lighthouse loomed above them, steadfast against the waves, and Daniel, for the first time in years, felt the weight of being a man rather than an empire. The tide had crept closer while they stood there, the water now foaming at the base of the rocks. The air was colder too, damp with mist, but Daniel barely noticed. The contract folder rested on the wall beside him, its pages curling at the edges from the salt air. He should have tucked it away, shielded it from the damp. Instead, he let it sit there, as if he had grown tired of protecting it. The old woman hadn't pressed him further. She simply stood near the lighthouse, shawl drawn tight, watching the horizon. Her stillness unsettled him more than any argument could have. It felt as though she trusted the sea to do her speaking for her. Daniel drew a breath, trying to steady himself. He thought of his office, the clean lines of glass, the hum of climate control, the certainty of polished desks and digital screens. Everything there was predictable, but here, with the waves pressing close, nothing felt certain. Finally, he broke the silence. I could still sign it, he said, nodding at the folder. Sell the land, tear down the lighthouse, build something new. I could erase all of it. Her gaze shifted to him, steady, calm. You could, but would you be erasing the lighthouse or yourself? Daniel looked away quickly, her words lodged too deep. He tried to reason with himself. This was land, stone, opportunity. Investors waited for his decision. His name carried weight because he never faltered, never let sentiment cloud his judgment. If he walked away now, what would that mean? But beneath the noise of logic, the sea pressed in again, carrying memories with it. He saw himself as a boy, sitting cross-legged on the stone steps of the lighthouse, tracing cracks with small fingers. He remembered a hand ruffling his hair, a voice humming, the smell of lavender and smoke. The image was so vivid it felt like stepping into another life. His throat tightened. Why now? He asked, his voice low. Why does it come back now? The woman's expression softened. Because you came back. Because your steps are quiet enough to hear it, you can set outrun memory forever. It waits patient as the sea. He pressed his hands into his coat pockets, as though anchoring himself. He didn't like the feeling rising in him, the pull of something he couldn't calculate or control. Yet it felt strangely like relief too, like loosening a grip he had held too tightly for too long. The wind gusted, catching the folder. Daniel's hand shot out instinctively to steady it. He held it there, fingers pressed against the damp leather. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Everything he had built, the money, the power, the endless climb, was reflected in those papers. They represented control, forward motion, certainty. But now, looking at them against the backdrop of the sea, they felt small, fragile. The old woman Sep's voice came softly. That paper will give you profit. But this place, it can give you back yourself. Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to retreat into certainty, but his words failed him. He lifted the folder, staring at it as though it held the answer. For years, decisions had been simple. If it yielded return, he signed. If it didn't, he walked away. But now the math was broken. He glanced at her. She wasn't pushing him, wasn't demanding. She was only waiting, her presence as patient as the waves. Something inside him shifted. Slowly he opened the folder, staring at the clean white pages. The contract terms blurred in the damp, the ink bleeding slightly. He ran his thumb over the top sheet, feeling the softened fibers. Then, before he could second guess, he tore it. The sound of paper ripping was sharp in the open air, startling against the drone of the sea. He tore again, smaller pieces this time, until the sheets fluttered from his hands like pale gulls. The wind caught them, carrying fragments across the rocks, into the water where they dissolved into nothing. Daniel stood frozen, breathing hard, his hands empty now. For the first time in years, they truly were empty. No contracts, no deals, no guarantees. Only the raw weight of choice. The old woman's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She didn't move closer, didn't speak. She only nodded, as if acknowledging something she had known all along. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound shaking. He felt stripped, vulnerable in a way that terrified him, yet beneath the fear, there was something else. A lightness, faint but unmistakable. The lighthouse loomed behind them, scarred and weathered, but still standing. It would remain, not as a profit line, but as a memory, a beacon, a part of himself. He had finally allowed back. Daniel looked at the sea, the endless horizon stretching before him. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to conquer it. He felt the urge to belong. The tide surged higher, licking at the rocks. He let the wind hit his face, let the salt sting his skin, and though he didn't speak it aloud, he knew something inside him had shifted. The turning tide was not only in the sea, it was in him. The papers were gone now, scattered to the wind and sea, their ink dissolving into salt water. Daniel stood with his hands still trembling, as if they hadn't yet caught up to what he had done. For years, his signatures had carried the weight of millions. His pen had toppled old buildings, raised towers of glass, bent entire projects to his will. But here, tearing paper felt heavier than all of it, like undoing more than a contract. Like undoing the years he had spent hardening himself. The old woman watched him quietly, her pale eyes shining with something that wasn't triumph. It was gentler than that, closer to relief. "You chose," she said softly. Daniel let out a rough breath, half a laugh, half a groan. "I don't know what I chose. I couldn't just do it." "You remembered," she replied. Her words settled into him like the tide pressing into shore. He looked at her, and for the first time, really saw her. The lines on her face weren't just age. They were years of waiting, years of standing against wind and loneliness. She had kept vigil here, not for profit or recognition, but for him. And he had nearly erased it all. "I left," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I forgot. All these years, I told myself I started in the city, that I owed everything to ambition. But I was lying, wasn't I? Belonged here first." She stepped closer, her hand lifting as though to touch his arm, then resting lightly against his sleeve. The gesture was simple, but it steadied him more than he expected. "You were a child," she said gently. "Forgetting was not your choice, but remembering can be." Her words loosened something inside him. He felt his chest ache, but it wasn't the ache of resistance anymore, it was the ache of release. Daniel looked at the lighthouse, its windows cracked, its paint stripped bare. He had once seen it only as ruin, now he saw it as resilience. It had stood through storms, just as she had, waiting for him, waiting so that he could stand here now, stripped of his armor, and finally belong again. "I've spent so much time running forward," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the tower, as if the past was an anchor. "But maybe it was the only thing that could steady me." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes soft. "That's what lighthouses do, son. They remind you where home is, even when the sea tries to carry you away." The word son no longer jarred him. It landed gently now, warming him in places he hadn't realized were cold. He swallowed hard, his voice thick. "I don't know how to make it right." "You already began," she said. "You chose not to erase what matters. That is how it starts." For a long while they stood together in silence, the sea washing over the rocks below. Daniel felt the wind tug at his coat, the salt sting his lips, the steady presence of the lighthouse behind him, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a man chasing time. He felt like a man who had finally stopped running. Slowly, he turned to her. "What happens now?" She looked at him with a kind of quiet pride. "Now you live with it. You keep the lighthouse standing, not for profit, not for power, but for memory, for yourself. And maybe, for those who come after." Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of his father, of the walls he had built, of the boy who had been frightened of storms but comforted by a shawl and a song. He thought of the man he had become, sharp-edged and untouchable. And then he thought of who he might yet be, if he allowed himself to stay here, if only for a while. The weight of his empire, the endless climb of profit and power, seemed smaller now. For years, he had been searching for something without knowing it. And here, at the edge of the sea, he had found it, not in numbers, not in contracts, but in remembering who he was. He turned back to the sea, his voice steady. "Now.
It will stand."
The lighthouse. "I see to it." The old woman's hand pressed gently against his arm, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. "Then you already redeemed more than you know." Daniel let the words settle, let the sound of the waves fold around him. Redemption wasn't grand, it didn't roar like a storm. It whispered, quiet and patient, like the sea against the rocks. And for the first time in his life, Daniel listened. The sun dipped lower, a pale gold bleeding across the horizon, softening the edges of sea and sky. The tide had reached its peak, and was beginning to draw back, leaving dark trails of kelp and foam clinging to the rocks. Daniel stood still, breathing in the damp air, letting it sting his lungs. The decision was made, the papers were gone. The old woman adjusted her shawl, her eyes on him, though she said nothing. She seemed to know words were no longer necessary. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel the need to fill silence either. The sea was enough. "I should go," he said at last. Though his voice was uncertain, his car sat waiting on the gravel path above the shore, black and gleaming, out of place against the weather-beaten cliffs. But his eyes didn't linger on it. Instead, they turned toward the small scatter of cottages in the distance, their chimneys thin against the fading light. The village. The old woman followed his gaze. "They still remember you," she said quietly. "Not as the man in the papers, but as the boy who once belonged here." Her words made his chest ache. He couldn't quite picture what they would remember, but he knew she was right. He let out a breath. "It feels like I've been away a lifetime." "You have," she said, her tone gentle. "But lifetimes can be bridged." They began walking together, leaving the lighthouse behind. The ground was uneven, the path narrow. But Daniel found himself slowing to her pace, without thought. The sound of the waves grew softer as they climbed, replaced by the rustle of grass, and the distant bark of a dog from the cottages below. As they walked, Daniel thought of the man he had been when he arrived, sharp, certain, armored in ambition. He had come to claim land, to stamp his name on stone and sea. Now he walked away without the contract, without the shield of profit. And somehow he felt lighter. They reached the crest of the path where the view widened. The lighthouse stood behind them, solitary against the ocean, its tower catching the last of the sun. For the first time, Daniel thought it looked less like a ruin and more like a guardian, weathered, yes, but steadfast. He stopped, turning to look at it one last time, His throat tightened. "It will stand," he murmured. The promise felt real now, anchored in him. The woman Sep's eyes softened. "So will you." Her words caught him off guard. He turned, studying her face, the fine lines, the silver hair caught in the wind, the patience that had outlasted years of waiting. She had kept vigil not only for the lighthouse, but for him. "Why didn't Setsu give up?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly, sadness and warmth woven together. "Because some things are worth waiting for. Even if you don't know it until they return." Daniel looked away, his chest full with something he couldn't name. Gratitude. Regret. Hope. All of it tangled together, heavy and light at once. They walked on, down toward the village. The cottages grew clearer now, their windows glowing faintly as lamps were lit inside. Smoke drifted from chimneys, curling into the evening sky. He could hear voices faintly, children laughing, someone calling a name, the scrape of a chair across stone. It was ordinary, humble, and it tugged at him with a force stronger than any skyscraper's skyline had ever done. At the edge of the village, a child ran past, chasing a ball. He glanced up at Daniel curiously, then darted away again. No fear, no judgment. Just simple curiosity. Daniel felt a small, unexpected smile tug at his lips. The woman noticed. "It's been a long time since you smiled like that," she said softly. Daniel let the smile linger, though it was tinged with sadness. "I almost forgot how." They reached the first cottage, its stone walls weathered but sturdy, the door painted blue. The woman paused there, her hand resting on the gate. "You'll find your way," she said, "not all at once, but step by step. Home isn't a place you buy, Daniel. It's a place you allow yourself to return to." He swallowed, his throat tight. "And if I don't know how to begin?" Her eyes softened, kind and unwavering. "Begin by staying." The words settled in him like the tide filling a hollow. For once, he didn't resist. As the evening deepened, Daniel turned from the car waiting on the cliff. He didn't walk toward it. Instead, he followed the old woman through the gate, toward the warmth of lamplight, the sound of voices, the quiet promise of belonging. Behind him, the lighthouse stood against the sea, a beacon that had waited, patient and unbroken, for his return. And Daniel Mercer, no longer only a businessman, stepped back into the life he had thought lost.